Once upon a time, two brothers set out to compile an anthology of their country's traditional folk tales. They were cultural researchers, seeking to preserve, glorify, and popularize the authentic culture of their people. The resulting anthology found huge mainstream success amongst Germans of all ages, and eventually, people all around the world. As you may have guessed by now, yes, I'm talking about the Brothers Grimm of fairy tale fame. The Brothers Grimm lived in a time when Germany was seeking to understand its identity, just starting to see itself as a unified nation with shared traditions and history. People living throughout what would soon become Germany shared a common Germanic language, so the Grimm brothers identified that language and its folk tales as an appropriate basis for the shared German national identity. The debate around the Grimm brothers' relationship to German nationalism is really interesting. It seems that the Grimm brothers' fairy tales played an important role not just in constructing a shared German identity, but in laying the foundation for a dark, twisted version of that identity, the ethnic nationalism, xenophobia, and anti-Semitism which reached their zenith in Hitler's Third Reich. In an essay on the Brothers Grimm, American scholar Lewis Snyder writes, "In selecting and refining their household stories, the Grimms place stress on some attitudes as particularly Germanic. They conveyed the impression that their tales reflected praiseworthy national traits of the German people, including authoritarianism, militarism, violence towards the outsider, and the strict enforcement of discipline. The social classes were set apart. The king, the count, the leader, the hero are glorified, while the lower class, the servants and peasants dependent upon them and obediently executing their commands, is praised. In contrast stand the avaricious, mendacious middle class of merchants and quack doctors and scheming Jews, outsiders who intruded through the dark forest into the orderly system of manor and village. Hence, the loathing for outsiders." End quote. If you've read any of the Grimm's original fairy tales, you might have noticed this. Not only are the tales violent, but it's a particular sort of violence. Violence that reinforces the established social order, glorifies the military, and punishes non-German outsiders, who are, of course, framed as deserving this punishment. I don't mean to suggest that the Brothers Grimm single-handedly caused the rise of Nazism, but the Nazis did adopt these stories, making them required reading in schools. And they glorified many of the same cultural values exemplified in the Grimm's collection. Now, the Grimm's fairy tales still maintain widespread popularity around the world to this day. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. You can enjoy these stories without being a Nazi. But here's the takeaway. Art is political. Which is to say, it has a political dimension. In our political work, in looking at ourselves and the people around us, we should pay attention to why certain aesthetics appeal over others. Art has a lot more to say about the values of the artist and the audience than we might think. And while we can enjoy all sorts of art, including problematic and controversial art, without necessarily adopting their worldviews, art and art movements provide windows into many perspectives, many politics, and even alternate futures. Finally, we're getting to the point. Art can be speculative, posing questions and potential answers about how things could be or should be in the future. When we pay attention to art and the audiences it draws, we get to peer into the psychological landscape of our world today. Windows into the minds of subjects of our contemporary political economic order. We see hopes, fears, optimism and pessimism, depression, and a feverish drive towards hyperproductivity, the desire to escape it all, and the resigned belief that we're not going to make it, not going to solve our problems before we're doomed. All these powerful, emotional worlds swirling around us, represented in the art that we create and enjoy. I believe art has a role to play in politics. I've thought a lot about the political valence of contemporary aesthetics and art movements, and about which art most accurately depicts the future I want to see. A future where we've tackled both environmental and social problems head-on, centering the human needs of people over the parasitic needs of capital. A future that looks forward instead of back, furthering our achievements in science, technology, and medicine, and using them to benefit everyone. I love art that encourages us to look forward like this, not with a resigned pessimism that we're doomed, nor a naive faith that the world will work itself out on its own, but a realistic look forward, with the knowledge and the strength to do the work ourselves, to solve the twin crises of environmental and political destruction, because we have to work for it. And hell, it might as well be decked out with geodesic domes, mosaics, and flower gardens. A lonely, thatch-roof cottage in a quiet woodland. Nothing but the sounds of birds chirping and a fresh breeze rustling the trees outside. Fresh linens cover a rustic hardwood table, upon which cools a loaf of fresh-baked homemade bread. Sunlight streams through the window onto a half-finished embroidery project. Mushrooms, ferns, and woodland critters delicately stitched to form the pattern on a feminine dress. Or maybe a spool of yarn, naturally dyed with plants, being knit into a warm cardigan or a scarf for the cold European winter. Cottagecore is an aesthetic trend that took shape online around the 2010s. It has something in common with morike, a Japanese fashion style centered around looking like you live in a forest. But cottagecore is more holistic in that it focuses on a whole lifestyle, not just a manner of dress. And similar to the 20th century arts and crafts movement, cottagecore disdains cheap mass-produced goods, the hectic pace of city life, and other ills of industrialism. Cottagecore embraces rural farm life, femininity and the domestic sphere, and a return to serene nature, away from the hustle and bustle of the city. The cottagecore lifestyle includes foraging, sewing, baking, gardening, and handcrafting from natural materials. Now, if you're anything like me, there's a lot that appeals about cottagecore. I love gardening, sewing, cooking, going for hikes, and gathering wild berries. I'd love to have my own cute little house in the forest, I'm not gonna deny that. That longing for a slower pace of life, for more time in nature and less time spent grinding away to pay bills or pay off debt. There is a lot of appeal in that for a lot of people right now. I think that's why we're seeing so many nature-focused aesthetics trending on platforms like Tumblr and TikTok. It's a shared yearning for what seems like a more wholesome, fulfilling way of life. But cottagecore cannot be the basis for a political movement. The cottagecore aesthetic has some serious faults that condemn it to a backwards-looking nostalgia, not a speculative peek at the future that we want to create. The most obvious issue at first glance is probably the way cottagecore romanticizes what is actually a very difficult life, if it even exists at all. Farm work is incredibly physically demanding, and the scale required to actually feed the world's population today involves a lot of machinery, and employs and exploits laborers on a vast scale. Even achieving self-sufficiency on the individual or family scale, as idealized in cottagecore, will take a lot more than spending your afternoons foraging and planting a few heads of lettuce. Because cottagecore scorns machinery and opts for isolated cottages over more populated communal living, the modes of production allowed within the aesthetic are fundamentally unable to provide the lifestyle for which it strives. Cottagecore is also incredibly Eurocentric. The specific sort of rural life idealized here is very much one that you would see in Grimm's fairy tales, with their thatched roof cottages, temperate deciduous forests, and European design motifs and material culture. It's romanticization of a certain cultural heritage at the exclusion of others. Needless to say, that fetishism of European exclusivity is at least a yellow flag, if not a red one yet. Now, those first two critiques seem pretty widespread on the internet, but there's another major issue with cottagecore that I don't see talked about as much. Cottagecore focuses entirely on the individual or small family group living in relative isolation from other people. There is no social dimension to cottagecore. It's about the individual experience. It's about getting away from it all, not just from the pressures of modern capitalism, but also away from other people. This antisocial aspect concerns me the most. Ultimately, where are all the other people in cottagecore? The world is approaching a population of 8 billion people. Are most of them to be excluded from access to homegrown organic produce, fresh air and water, lovingly handmade outfits, acres of forest to explore? Is this exclusion violent? Are wealthy, often white city dwellers dreaming of rural escape the only ones deserving of this lifestyle? We can almost imagine a post- or mid-apocalyptic cottagecore, where the have-nots are subjected to extreme climate, devastating violence, deadly diseases, etc. Meanwhile, the haves build their wholesome cottages and gardens in the remaining habitable areas on foundations of violent exclusion. This probably sounds way too extreme for such a sweet, cozy aesthetic. But we have to speculate about these things when we explore the political dimensions of a text. So, I suggest we don't grant cottagecore that sort of political dimension. It's probably best seen as a nostalgic longing for a quieter, slower past, where the air was cleaner and the forests and farms not yet degraded into soil-depleting monocrops. Most people who like cottagecore just enjoy these romantic aspects and know we can't actually build a world like that. It's a visually pleasing fantasy that provides good photo ops and content for aesthetic blogs. And I know it sounds like I went really hard against cottagecore here, so just to be clear, if you're into cottagecore for just that nostalgic fantasy aspect, I take no issue with that. But, and I hate to say this, for some people, cottagecore really does take on that political dimension. For some extremist groups, a return to that imagined simple life with its patriarchal and xenophobic authority structure really is the future that they want to see. Ecofascism is what happens when fascists start embracing the cause of fighting climate change. Many scholars suggest that we'll see this ideology grow a lot as climate change becomes increasingly difficult for even the privileged to ignore, and as their proposed solutions become more violent and inhumane. Eco-fascists blame marginalized groups, especially immigrants and poor countries in the global south, for environmental destruction. They may suggest solutions like closing borders to refugees, or even leaving vast regions of the world to face mass extinction alone, without aid from those who can afford to save themselves. For eco-fascists, climate change is a sign that the human population has grown too large, so natural disasters are merely a sort of purge, a violent but necessary cleansing so that the remaining population can turn to a more sustainable way of life. Of course, the poor countries who they blame for environmental destruction have some of the lowest carbon footprints compared to the parasitic consumerism of the eco-fascists' would-be chosen survivors. Solving climate change isn't the point here. As Naomi Klein puts it, ecofascism is environmentalism through genocide. But I'd go further and reverse this. It's really more like genocide, justified through the veneer of environmentalism. So-called scientific racism has never been scientific. It's just hatred trying to dress up as necessity. And it is crucial that we reject it at every turn. Cottagecore is unfortunately rather compatible with ecofascism, to the point that some right-wing groups have embraced cottagecore as a way to push their reactionary politics. Insofar as cottagecore as an aesthetic lacks a strong political valence, it becomes co-optable by some very dangerous ideologies. Remember the Nazis' adoption of Grimm's fairy tales? The story of cottagecore today looks strikingly similar. And that's no future I want to see. So what's the alternative? Well, let me introduce you to Solarpunk. You may have seen it. Colorful, futuristic cities where glass and metal playfully interweave with lush foliage, whimsical art, and human inhabitants as diverse as the flowers in a garden. Solarpunk doesn't shy away from technology, large-scale infrastructure, and dense populations. Rather, it seeks a way to support the needs of both the planet and its inhabitants, without prioritizing one or the other. A solarpunk future is not brought about through genocide or other forms of exclusion, but through democracy and real scientific advancement. Through technology built for all, and conscious deliberation where everyone is allowed a seat at the table. Not just the representatives of wealthy countries or corporations, but the people threatened most directly by climate change, war, and other dangers. Solarpunk represents a continuation of the best things humanity has achieved, and a conscious struggle to avoid the mistakes of our past. Unlike cottagecore, solarpunk is a politically and socially conscious aesthetic. So much so that many make the case for solarpunk as a political movement in itself. Andrew Hudson writes in an essay on solarpunk, "The very name solarpunk implies that scientific breakthroughs alone won't fix our environmental, social, and economic problems. After all, it posits a world of solar energy abundance and then argues that we will still have need of punks. No magical tech fixes for us. We'll have to do it the hard way, with politics." Solarpunk shares a close relationship with activism based on prefigurative politics, where movements practice using the sorts of social organizations and decision-making processes that they hope will one day transform the world. Many groups engaged in this work today actually call themselves solarpunks. Solarpunk in practice looks like starting now, where we can, planting seeds and building momentum and scale. Not just theorizing possible alternatives, but trying to have them in place already when the world is ready to turn towards them. Think of a network of mycelium, hidden underground, but distributing resources throughout the entire forest. The solarpunk critique of science and technology is not regressive, but progressive. It asks, how can these great human accomplishments be directed to provide the most social good? And how can our society encourage future innovations and continue doing good? There's a shared understanding that science, technology, and medicine are great accomplishments, central to the success of any future society. Rather than shunning modern technology, solarpunk welcomes innovation as long as it serves people over profits. An online manifesto reads, "In Solarpunk, we've pulled back just in time to stop the slow destruction of our planet. We've learned to use science wisely for the betterment of our life conditions as part of our planet. We're no longer overlords. We're caretakers. We're gardeners." Something you'll quickly notice about solarpunk art is that there aren't many cottages. Its subject matter is usually urban, featuring tall skyscrapers, bustling plazas, and skylines where both trees and man-made structures coexist. Solarpunk does its best to fix cities, rather than abandon them along with most of the world's population. Concrete and glass are modded out with futuristic tech like colorful solar panels, along with signs of habitation like rooftop gardens, people sharing food, laundry hanging out to dry. Lush foliage overtakes the desolation of roads and empty lots. At last, the so-called concrete jungle is actually biodiverse, its own kind of ecosystem. In Solarpunk, there is a recognition that the world is densely populated with cities. These are the infrastructure that exists, the places that most people call home. This is the world that we are given to work with, and the people whose lives we intend to save. We'll take it all. The rural areas and urban, the vast social inequalities, the fragile climate, the huge and diverse global population. And we'll transform this world, not destroy it. Now, for sure, there are arguments about the fundamental unsustainability of cities or of technology like solar panels, which I'm sure we can get into in future episodes. But the message of inclusivity, radical acceptance, and doing the work rings clear. There's no biblical sense that we've fallen from grace or a longing for simpler times. Solarpunk is focused on forward-thinking solutions that recognize and incorporate the best of human achievements and a belief in the human potential still to be realized in the future. As the manifesto puts it, as our world roils with calamity, we need solutions, not only warnings. Solutions to thrive without fossil fuels, to equitably manage real scarcity and share in abundance instead of supporting false scarcity and false abundance, to be kinder to each other and to the planet we share. Solarpunk is at once a vision of the future, a thoughtful provocation, a way of living, and a set of achievable proposals to get there. Now, if you're like most people I've seen, you're probably thinking, yeah, right. Solarpunk can't happen. It's too utopian, too naive, too unrealistically optimistic, and so on. Well, I hear your concerns. In fact, to some extent I share them. But if solarpunk is too fantastical, too idealized, at least it's idealized in the right direction. Maybe the world of the future won't look anything like the solarpunk art that we see today. It won't be a perfect world. But is it so wrong to think that with cooperation and effort, the world couldn't be better? The idea that we're stuck in the endless present, that nothing can change or improve, seems far more unrealistic. But still, that pessimism is real. A lot of us are feeling it right now, myself included. Sometimes, solarpunk really does look too hopeful, utopian to the point of ridiculousness. It's a common critique of solarpunk, and I'm not sure we can just dismiss it in a world where so many people are feeling stuck, feeling like we're powerless to avert our own doom. Those feelings are valid, and I want our art and political work to leave room for them. What does it mean to be a solarpunk and also struggling to find hope? To fight for a future that looks both increasingly out of reach and increasingly necessary? To recognize and resist the urge to just give up? To me, solarpunk feels less like destiny and more like a demand. We demand solarpunk now because there's no better option. This podcast isn't about convincing you that everything will turn out all right in the end. It's not here to suggest that a few solar panels and community gardens are going to fix all our problems. Climate change is already upon us. Storms are getting stronger, heat waves are rendering areas unsafe for habitation, islands are being swallowed up in the sea. But there's no hard deadline here, and the sooner we make change, the more destruction we avert. As we move away from burning fossil fuels and other environmentally destructive practices, there's work to be done in the social sphere too. Building community, support networks, networks of care, and mutual aid to take care of our neighbors when disasters inevitably strike. We need to strengthen the sense that we aren't alone, that social atomization is just an illusion that leads only to loneliness and cruelty. So, when eco-fascists and other backwards-looking reactionaries want to sacrifice their neighbors to preserve a privileged, destructive way of life, we can resist that pressure. We can instead propose our alternative. Not just in theory, but we can show the work that's already begun. Networks of care spiraling out like mycelium, technologies hacked and repurposed for democratic use. There are things we can do now to build resilience in the face of what's inevitable, and to lessen the destruction that isn't inevitable. We demand Solarpunk Now because we can and must start now. whether we believe in utopia or not. My name is Luca, and I'll be your host for Solarpunk Now, the podcast about politics, science, tech, philosophy, and whatever else it'll take to get us out of this mess. This podcast will probably be largely interview-based, with the occasional solo deep dive like this was. But ultimately, I'm not sure how the format will change as the project develops. I've never done anything like this before, and I'm hoping the content and production quality of the podcast will continue to improve as I figure out what the hell I'm doing. Basically, I'm here to learn, think critically, and get inspired just as much as you are. So thanks for joining me on this ride. My degree is in literature, hence the fairy tales, but I also have some background in the sciences, and I'm really excited about the interdisciplinary work that happens when we get the sciences and humanities in a good faith conversation with one another. I hope to highlight ideas from all sorts of different fields, including the conversations that happen between them. And I'm also interested in art, activism, and theory that happens outside of formal academic institutions. My main goal with this podcast is to introduce ideas, projects, and theories that I find inspiring or groundbreaking. Basically, anything that lifts that veil of pessimism and hopelessness, that sense that nothing can be done. The world is changing quickly, not standing still, and our politics should be focused on ensuring that change is directed at serving people over profits, at caring for both our environment and our fellow humans. I want to encourage networking, communication, and collaboration outside of the destructive death spiral of our status quo. The world won't get better if we sit here and wait for the powers that be to fix things, because the sorts of changes that need to happen are in opposition to the dictums of capital and neoliberal power. I want to encourage you, the listener, to start or join projects of your own, based in your local circumstances and personal strengths. I see this podcast as a starting point, not a finish line. As a crack in the glass that distorts our view of the world, shattering the illusion that we're stuck with a narrow range of possibility, as a ray of sunlight in a hazy, polluted sky. I hope you'll join me in exploring these exciting proposals, and that you'll take a stand with me in demanding a brighter future. To quote cultural theorist Mark Fisher, "The very oppressive pervasiveness of capitalist realism means that even glimmers of alternative political and economic possibilities can have a disproportionately great effect. The tiniest event can tear a hole in the gray curtain of reaction which has marked the horizons of possibility. From a situation in which nothing can happen, suddenly anything is possible again." Solarpunk Now is written, hosted, and produced by me, Luca Dowell. The closing quote was from Mark Fisher's book, Capitalist Realism. The Solarpunk theme song is by Red Keener on SoundCloud, with additional music by Gabriel Rivas. You can follow the show on Twitter at SolarpunkCast, or visit solarpunkcast.net for all episodes, including show notes. If you like what you hear and want to help support my project, please share the podcast with your friends and followers. Let me know if you'd be interested in donating or becoming a recurring supporter, and if you or someone you know needs written transcriptions of episodes, please let me know there's a need for that. Finally, remember the realization of any vision requires action. I strongly encourage you to get involved with local organizations whose goals align with the brighter future that you want to see. Analysis is important, but we have to back it up with practice. Keep dreaming big, and keep up the good work.